Umoya Ulight, Umoya Upright. Guys, welcome to Moya Podcast and to our weekly live streams that we do with Steve. I'm wondering if it's not a bit much for the old man to do it every week. I wonder, Steve, if you are coping. I hope you are coping.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am, Ntsiki. I'm actually fine. I'll cope with this.
Okay, that's wonderful. So we really enjoyed last week's lecture when you were telling us about the ANC Youth League and the type of beast that the ANC actually is. And then I think we got up to, you said we're going to start this week on PW Botha. I think you said, what? Am I correct?
Yes, Ntsiki. Yeah. But then let's put that into context, Ntsiki. This was in the context of, what happens after Black Wednesday. Remember, Black Wednesday actually happens in October 1977. But let me just point out a few things here, which will put PW Botha into context. If you think about it, in the last 35 years or so, UW Botha has been at the center of what apartheid is. And this is precisely because of, the heightened levels of violence, that PW Botha actually generated. But the reason why we came to PW Botha was to try and understand, how apartheid South Africa responded, to the mass movement of the 1970s. And I think this is the one theme, Ziki, that is, seldom understood, or if or seldom covered at all. And whenever it is covered, it is a theme that in itself, is subject to a great deal of misinterpretation. Ziki, what we are talking about here, is that, PW Botha comes, after the mass movement of the 1970s. But last week, when we had this discussion, a critical question was raised. I think it actually came from the floor. And the question was, and I think we need to address that because, PW Botha's term in office, or 2 terms and a half to be precise, those 2 terms were actually, in themselves, a kind of reflection of what, white society in South Africa at the time would have understood as the immediate threat to white supremacy. Now, the point I've just made is that Botha comes, at the back of the mass movement of the 1970s. Part of what I explained about that mass movement is the role of the ANC underground, because the ANC underground actually establishes itself as having been the basis of the mass movement. But we'll come back to that, maybe not today, some other time. It is important to bear that in mind, that there were attempts on the part of the ANC, to project itself as being at the center of the mass movement of the 1970s. But last week I did explain, and I picked up a few campaigns that were definitely illustrating to us the disconnect, between the mass movement and what the ANC would have actually stood for. Now, here is, where PW Botha comes into this. The whole Soweto revolt actually lasted from the 16th of June until Black Wednesday on the 19th of October 1977. So once we grasp that, we will understand that this was an extended insurrection. And there were a number of events, which in themselves would have defined the moment. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on each one of them. I'm just going to mention, these events precisely because in and of themselves, they heightened white anxieties, white fears, about the possible attack and assault on white supremacy. Now, the 16th of June itself would be the starting point. Now, the one aspect of the 16th of June that everybody can associate, the movement with is the death of Hector Peterson. But related to that was the death of a white person, and that was Dr. Melville Edelstein. Now, that is something I explain elsewhere in detail. For now, let people understand that the death of Edelstein was suppressed, deliberately suppressed. And this was for purposes of, again, undermining a Black radical tradition. That would have been the first. The second that I mentioned would have been the two campaigns undertaken by students in August and September 1976. And what I said about the two campaigns is that they were moving the geography of violence away from Soweto into Johannesburg CBD. Now, that in itself would have heightened, the fears, anxieties, and further traumatized white society, seeing the violence coming closer to their neighborhoods. But that was, in fact, a strategic shift, that the students would have undertaken at this point. Now, the final, aspect of 1976 that really deepened white fears about what was happening was the event around Wellington Chazibani. Now, let me go, quickly about Chazibani actually plotted, the attack on, that was an attack in actual fact, the attack on Carlton Center. And there is no doubt here that the target of that attack would have been white people. And this happened on the 7th of December 1976. The long and the short of it is that Chazibani was actually detained for his role in this thing. And within 2 days, he was actually dead. He died in police detention at John Foster Square. Now, all of these were events of 1976 that heightened white fears. So in white society at this time, if you wanted to know what is it, that they were particularly concerned about, it would have been a Black mass movement. And that's how they would have understood 1976 to have been about. Now, enter into this equation Solomon Mahlangu, and this is in June 1977. Still, this is part of the same movement. Any attempt, to detach that particular event from the movement that had been taking place in 1976 would actually be stretching the analogy. But this is something that we can debate in a different kind of forum. But the Solomon Mahlangu story is quite interesting, because there was the death of two civilians, and civilians here is carefully defined in the South African context of the time. Black people are not civilians in 1977. Black people are either hostel dwellers or they are subject of a Bantustan chief. That's the category that Black people fall into. But when they talk about civilians, it is white people. Strange enough, the ANC recognized this as well. So the ANC's policy was that in any attack that we undertake, we are not going to endanger the lives of civilians. They did not actually say white civilians, but in the context of the time, it was understood that civilians are white people. So what the mass movement of the 1970s was actually representing, it was what, we should be able to define quite easily, given the history of South Africa. We should be able to say this was Black radicalism at work, and we would be able to reflect quite sincerely and honestly on that historical moment. But the historical moment itself, because it was a Black radical moment, it was a moment inspired by a Black radical tradition. And if we were to define it even more specifically, it was a movement inspired by the Black consciousness philosophy. And that in itself was understood in white society. And they also, looking at the events that I've just, indicated to you, cumulatively, what they meant was that there was a very serious threat that was facing white society in South Africa in 1976 and 77. And it is in that context that Black Wednesday happens. But Black Wednesday is an attack only on the organizational manifestations of the Black radical tradition. The issue here is, how do you deal with that tradition as embodied in people? People are the bearers of that tradition. Now, how do you deal with that? How do you make sure that the next moment of mass uprising will not be inspired by a Black radical paradigm? So this the apartheid state had to consider and to deal with. Now, what they do in the second half of 1977, and this is from July up to the end of the year, is to reorganize the administration. And the first thing that they do is to replace the police chief in Soweto, because Soweto is the epicenter of this mass movement. Now, they replaced the police chief, Andre Fessel, who was at the time the face of apartheid police in Soweto. And they replaced him with a more brutal, kind of officer. And that was Brigadier Louis Gerber. Now, as an aside, sometime in 2016, Pakistau actually invited Louis Gerber to some kind of a function in Soweto. Now, you realize that, people simply did not understand who Louis Gerber was. But Louis Gerber is the man who introduced two things to deal with the mass movement of 1976. The first was to introduce the K9 unit, which went mauling Soweto students. And that had an impact, on the movement. And the second was to introduce a green car. If you go to Hector Peterson Museum, I have actually put up panels that actually explain that historical moment. So there was increased brutality when Louis Gerber came onto the picture. Now, in the meantime, again in July, August of 1977, the Nationalist Party had its conference. And in that conference, it was decided that B.J. Foster failed to deal with the mass movement of 76, 77. And he was therefore, deemed to be unsuitable to continue to be the prime minister. And the Nationalist Party elected P.W. Botha as successor. And this is where the answer to the question comes. When P.W. Botha comes, in the white imaginary, in the white supremacist imaginary, this is the man who's going to deal with the mass movement of 1976-77. And he actually makes that promise. But once P.W. Botha actually takes up office, he comes up with a kind of, statements that are actually pointing to where his emphasis was going to be. And out of the figment of his imagination, P.W. Botha tells South African white people that out there is a total onslaught waiting to befall them. And that total onslaught is borne by the ANC and its military wing, MK. And this is where the whole communist, socialist, stroke communist rhetoric, comes into play. In fact, when I say rhetoric, I recall, briefly that, I just saw some news channel saying, a guy who is said to be a professor of rhetoric in some obscure American university was being interviewed on Trump. And I thought, come to think of it, rhetoric has actually become a branch of study in political science. And my thought was that in South Africa, if ever there was a politician who made rhetoric a science, it was P.W. Botha. He picked up the rhetoric that the ANC were the bearers of the Marxist socialist stroke communist menace, to white society, and that it had to be checked. Now, this was political rhetoric. This was not even, appealing to white society. This was actually P.W. Botha appealing to White House and 10 Downing Street, because in the two places, two politicians who committed themselves to rolling back communism were about to take office. In the US, you had Reagan coming into the White House. And in the UK, you had Margaret Thatcher coming in. And P.W. Botha was aware that these two were actually coming into office on the basis of a promise that they were going to roll back communism wherever it manifested itself. So this was a political rhetoric that P.W. Botha used, not to pass messages that were meaningful to South African society, but to endear apartheid South Africa, to Washington and to Downing Street. And in that respect, he actually succeeded, because while the two may have participated, in all the campaigns about sanctions, about boycotts, about isolation, secretly they went on supporting the apartheid regime, precisely because P.W. Botha projected himself, as at the center of the struggle or the fight against the spread of communism. And for that reason, he would have received that sort of support. So when the question came, was apartheid South Africa more menaced by the Roy Gevaar, which is Marxist, Leninist, socialist, kind of, liberation struggle, or were they concerned about the black radical, kind of campaign, bringing to an end white supremacy? What I'm saying is that rhetorically speaking, it appeared to be the Roy Gevaar that was, at the center of P.W. Botha's policy. But what did he do inside the country? What P.W. Botha did inside the country, and I'm going to use a language that is, that most South Africans are not quite familiar with. But this is a language that is used in Black radical studies, in the African diaspora. The dispensation that P.W. Botha was putting into place at any time from 79 to 1988 was in fact an anti-Black, an anti-Black dispensation, precisely because he understood one principal and important issue. White society was menaced by the possibilities of a radical Black revolution. And that is what P.W. Botha had to deal with. Now, it is what he did inside the country that illustrates quite convincingly that P.W. Botha was more concerned, about, the threat that would come out of a kind of Black radical liberation struggle formation than he did about the Roy Gevaar. If you look at the 1980s, you think about areas where the mass movement was quite easily organized. It was in the high schools, it was in the universities, it was also in the workplace. This is where the mass mobilization of the 1970s actually took place. But if you want to extend it, it was also in the world of the arts. Medupi Writers Association. It was an association of poets, playwrights, but all of these were inspired by the Black radical philosophy of Black consciousness. So, what I'm putting forward here is that the reason why Foster was removed was precisely because he couldn't deal with the Black radical liberation struggle movement. And it was on the promise of him being that P.W. Botha was catapulted to leadership. So the answer to the question last week is precisely that. It is the Black radical, that was more of a threat to white supremacy than the Roy Gevaar. And by the way, tomorrow is actually May Day. And maybe just as a reflection, May Day actually enters the South African liberation struggle vocabulary in 1950.
Okay, we seem to be having network issues with Ndate Steve. Just gonna wait for him to try again. A reminder that we have Moya Political Series at 8 p.m. tonight. We were in conversation with Professor Siposiepe, so it's a really hot episode. So that's at 8 o'clock. So right now we're just warming ourselves up for that. Okay, I'm just getting that is Steve back onto the stage. All right, that is Steve, we got you.
Okay, the point I was making is that it was important to address this question. It was important to address it in the context of what happens in the 1980s. So my argument here, is that on the one hand, you had the apartheid state and PW Botha or PW Botha's policy, being structured in such a way that it was dealing with the mass movement of the 1970s. But at the same time, it was preempting another possible outbreak, of the same kind of mass movement that may be inspired by the Black radical tradition. Now, rather than owning up to that, PW Botha uses, the total onslaught, figment of his imagination, and actually uses the ink as a kind of a scarecrow. But in actual fact, like I pointed out, the reason for doing that was to endear himself to the White House and as well as to 10 Downing Street. In 80s, still, the target here is actually the Black radical tradition. And what happens early in the 1980s actually points, to that kind of a design. Once, action is being taken,
We seem to be having network issues this evening with Ndate Steve. His phone is hanging now. Reminder that if you want your comments on screen, oh, sorry guys, I'm exhausted. If you want your comments on screen, you have to comment from YouTube. So I can't access the comments from Facebook and Twitter. If you want to have your comments on screen, please come to YouTube, Moya, and then you can be engaged fully with the elder. Okay, he's backstage again. Let's try this again.
can you hear me now?
All right. Hey, network today, huh?
Yeah, but I think, what I'm going to do, I'll take this up to 1985. So it will be about the next 15 minutes. The idea is that, from Black Wednesday in 1977 up to 1985, what you are seeing here is a consistent assault on the Black radical tradition. This does not only happen, in relation to mass mobilization. It happens across, it happens even in lecture theaters in universities, especially those universities that at the time were considered open universities. But let's go back a little. Where I was explaining a kind of a paradigm shift in the next moment of mass mobilization following Black Wednesday. And the first, like I pointed out, happened in Port Elizabeth. And here, this is where Tozamile Botha, came out and established what he called the Port Elizabeth, and the name is significant. He called it the Port Elizabeth Black Community, programs. Now, that in itself was quite significant. The black in the name suggested a continuation with the mass movement of the previous decade, of 1976-77. And PEPCO was established in 1979. Its dynamic was that it was not only a civic organization, but it also, encapsulated worker issues in the workplace. And the motor industry in Uitenhage became, the center of that contestation. So again, I mean, I cannot explain this fully, but the whole idea that the struggle was then beginning to shift away from mass-based struggles that would be defined as the struggles of the Black race. The struggle was being fragmented. Trade union labor issues were coming into the fore, and in that in itself was yet another process of undermining, the Black radical tradition. Because part of what you have in trade union kind of activism would be the incorporation of Marxist, Leninist, kinds of presumptions and assumptions about what the struggle was about. And this is precisely what happened. And it is in this context that the National Union of Mine Workers was actually established. An important note to make here about the resurgence of trade union activity is that they did not come into existence as a result of working class pressure on employers. It was on the advice of some American experts to the apartheid state that the one thing that you should do is to legalize trade unions. So trade unions were legalized, and in fact, a commission of inquiry was established, led by Dr. Wehen, and he recommended that trade unions should be legalized. And that's how the National Union of Mine Workers was established. And the next one to be established was actually the Food and Allied Workers Union, which became absolutely critical in the retail trade. The point I'm making here is that the emergence of trade unions would have had a big impact, a significant impact on any mobilization around the Black race, because that is precisely what it did. And within a year of unions coming into existence, some major event actually took place that divided, political activism, particularly in the Gauteng region. And this was debates between, people who were more committed to the Azapo tradition, who felt that, the struggle is a struggle for Black people and white people shouldn't be part of that struggle. Now, that question was tested in a conference of Azapo held at the St. Peter's Seminary in Hammanskraal in 1982. Now, at that conference, the issue of white membership came to the fore, and it is a question that divided Azapo. There was a major walkout by people who believed that the struggle should be a non-racial undertaking and that Azapo should actually incorporate members across the races. Now, I still insist to this day, and I know I have been contradicted in a number of programs for that, but I still insist that Neville Alexander was at the center of that split. And once Azapo was split in 1982, it set the stage for the establishment of the UDF in Mitchell's Plain in 1983. Now, yet again, part of what you are seeing here is that apartheid state's assault on the Black radical tradition was being complemented, by the politics of the left. If you consider, the creation of the UDF as a creation of a politics on the left. Now, from that point onwards, you are beginning to see the misinterpretation of what the Black radical tradition in South African politics and in mass mobilization actually stood for. But maybe before we come to an end, here is a very important event that takes place in 1982, which reveals, the extent to which, the apartheid state would go to actually establish its own paradigm on Black struggles, if you like. In 1982, I mentioned FAU, the Food and Allied Workers Union, deliberately, because it then features quite prominently in what happens next. In 1982, a white trade unionist is actually arrested, taken to John Foster Square, interrogated, and within a certain period of time, he dies in detention. That is Neil Agate. Neil Agate established, a kind of a trade union where, precisely because, he was exposed to a great deal of abuses suffered by black workers in the workplaces. He was a doctor at Baragwanath and at Tembisa Hospital. So he was actually a surgeon. And at the time, he was actually attending to quite a good number. At Baragwanath, I would know, stab wounds every weekend. People were getting stabbed every weekend. Remember, so were not, the weapon of choice. The knife was. So Neil Agate had to deal with a great number of stab wounds, but these were people who were at the same time employed. And once he started understanding their experiences, he was attracted to wanting to help them. And he set up that trade union. But, in 1982, he was actually taken into custody and he was killed. Now, this actually happens in that context, where there are contestations about whether whites can actually make a meaningful participation in black struggles. And you can imagine what that event would have done. It swayed the public opinion the other way. And, people started seeing the meaningfulness, of white participation in the struggle. And this is only in 1982. So the point I'm making here is that there were possibilities that the next moment of uprising in the 1980s could still have been inspired by a black radical thought process. But when one looks at what happens between 1977 and 1983, one sees a twin-pronged attack on the black radical tradition. On the one hand, it is an attack by P.W. Botha, and he does this in two ways. The one way is to accentuate, quite needlessly, the idea that the ANC represents a total onslaught. And the other way is to reorganize the public sphere. Ntiki, the next time we talk, let's talk about how P.W. Botha reimagined the public sphere in such a way that the public sphere became anti-black by definition. And this has to do with the ways in which the high schools were reimagined, the ways in which, interference in universities, was heightened, with a view to making sure that not yet another Tiro emerges from any Onkgopotse Tiro, not another Onkgopotse Tiro will emerge from any of the universities. You needed an institutional reimagining to ensure that that does not happen. And in the high schools, they made sure that not another Tsietsi Mashenene and Khotso Seatlholo emerges. And you will see how that institutional reimagining actually happened. And in the workplace, suddenly, employment preferences went to certain sections of Black society. There were those that were excluded on the basis that they were klapgoeiers because they were, part of the stayaways of 1976 and 1977. So there was a way in which people could be identified and be boxed, into that particular category. But all of this was done as part of the policy of not only undermining, but a systematic assault on the Black radical tradition. I have spoken about, the fact that that would have happened in the, as part of politics, but it also happened in the universities. And very briefly, part of what happens in 1984 is that Wits, UCT, and University of Natal are open to Black students. But it is in 1985 that a mass of Black students go into these universities and into the humanities. Now, what actually gets taught there is precisely a continuation of what is happening, to the Black radical tradition. You never get taught about, the Black consciousness movement. And when you are taught about that, it is a critique of it. It is a misrepresentation of it, misinterpretation of it. But more than that, it is minimizing it. But on the other hand, you do not have black academics and intellectuals immediately after Black Wednesday who reflected on that black mass movement. Reflected on it in such a way that they could have established a paradigm that students could then reflect on when they came to university in the 1980s. Instead, what students had to deal with was Sophia Town and and the other poet Don Matera, Sophia Town and Don Matera were perfect distractions, away from a black radical reflection of the 1950s, because what they symbolized was the fact that a non-racial society can work. But if you think about it, Sophia Town was anything but a model of a non-racial society. So the point I'm making here is that the politics of the 1980s and the mass movement of the 1980s was not inspired by a black radical thought process. And that's understandable why that was not the case. And I'm saying that was not the case because the black radical tradition was subjected to a systematic attack, from all fronts. From the right, it would have been the apartheid state. And from the left, in fact, at the time, we even, came up with a term describing, the left of South Africa of the 1980s. We referred to it as the white left, because although the UDF was definitely a non-racial outfit, we knew that the think tank, was a think tank that was steeped in the Marxist-Leninist tradition. Other than Gwede Mantashe and probably, Philip Dexter and a few others, you don't get a sense that there was depth in the understanding of the Marxist-Leninist, kinds of approaches in the UDF at the time. So what this actually generated, and again, this is a term that is defined in terms of the black radical tradition. Part of what you see in that period, 1984 to 1993, and this is something that we shall come back to from time to time, is what Frank Wilderson, a black radical scholar, defined it as black as absence. Black as absence in a sense that, black people don't think through what political processes, to actually undertake. But the thinking is actually done by, let's face it was actually done by whites, and that's the issue. But I know these are difficult, kinds of truths to deal with. Can they be proved? For someone who was at West in 1985 to 1992, I think I have overwhelming evidence, to prove the point. But the issue here is that the left tradition in South Africa was as much an enemy of the black radical tradition, if not much more than that, than the apartheid state would have been. I'm not too sure if we still have time, but if we
10 minutes.
Oh, okay. A short break.
Oh, okay. You're just taking a minute to breathe in. Yeah, we've got about 10 more minutes.
We got about 10 minutes.
Um,
Okay, let's get at it. I mean, we are in 1985 now. I hope, look, the issue here is that, I'm not making political statements. This is actually a reflection on the historical developments in South Africa from Black Wednesday, at least up to 1993, and I think we should be able to get there, in future things. But if we go back to this period, and again here I'm going to be taking yet another example that some people make, and I really want people to look into these facts, because once again it reflects on the character of the black radical tradition, and particularly one that has not actually been articulated quite clearly. And I know you're going to get some are going to get a bit upset. But this is going back to Neil Agate. Now, Neil Agate, as I pointed out, was killed in police detention at John Foster Square in 1982. Now, what happened on that day, on the day of his burial in 1982? I said he was a trade unionist. He was very popular with the workers, particularly those who were in the food and allied industry. And, as usual, workers went to Neil Agate's funeral. The Agate family were hoping for a very calm, decent, respectable kind of funeral. But the guys came and, it was turned into a kind of a toy spectacle. They carried the coffin to the cemetery. And after the funeral, there was a great deal of dancing and singing right up to Johannesburg CBD, where there were, clashes with the police. And as people spread out to, different parts of Soweto, those that came the deep group side, remembered that, by the way, Credo Mutwa in 1976 made a statement that actually made him the enemy of the people. Now, I'm correcting this because that attack on Credo Mutwa did not happen in 1976. It happened in 1982. Yes, in 1976, there was dancing and singing outside Credo Mutwa's home, and the whole thing fizzled out very quickly. Let me just point out something else here. Between 1978 and 1982, Credo Mutwa's village, the village in central western Jabavu, was a tourist attraction. And it is Credo who was taking the tourists, through the whole village and explaining to them, what those artifacts were all about. And this was happening between, 78 and 82. So I can prove that the attack on Credo that led to him leaving Soweto for keeps and actually leaving South Africa and going to Bophuthatswana actually happened in 1982 and not in 1976. Yes, he made the statement that he made to the Civil Commission in 1976. Yes, it enraged the students. And I remember on the day in question, it was a Sunday, we were coming back from a funeral of a young man called Sicelo Dlomo, who was shot by police at Dlamini, in Dlamini. And yes, people went and danced and the whole thing fizzled out. And like I say, Credo stayed in Soweto until 1982. But it was when returning from Neil Agate's funeral that those people started attacking Credo in the ways that he actually described. And, the whole idea that it is on that day that his wife was raped, that in itself is so inconsistent with what the Black radical mass movement of the 1970s was all about. There's one thing that came out of the Black mass movement of the 1970s. This was not stated, but it was there. And it was that no political objective is worth pursuing if its realization is contingent upon visiting violence on other Black people. Let me give you an example. Here in Diepkloof, we had policemen, who were known to have participated, in firing shots at mobs. One of them in Atteridgeville, and we could identify the policeman in question. But these are people we had, been living cheek by jowl with for more than 15, 20 years. We had developed very strong affinities, for us to visit violence on them. And that is extended to Credo as well. Why, if there wouldn't be an attack on Black policemen, there would be an attack on Credo? It didn't make sense. So it is not the student, mob that attacked Credo in the way that is being described in 1976. That attack actually happened in 1982. And the students who were in the forefront of it were students in a school a stone throw away from Credo Mutua's home, Bupa Senata High School in Diepkloof. Those were the students who, at the time, were in the forefront of the COSAS, movement. In fact, in Diepkloof, if you wanted to know where COSAS was at Bupa Senata High School. And it is them who went to that funeral, Neil Agat. And it is them who, because they were neighbors, they were close to him. They were close to his home. They knew all of this, and they therefore activated that kind of an attack on him. The issue here is that just, students of the SSRC were coming out of the Black, radical tradition, Black consciousness philosophy, and that was our understanding of the situation. But in the 1980s, it was so easy, for the violence to be generated within Black society itself. And that was actually the machinations of the apartheid state. If you think about it, it is unlikely that Makis Kosana would have suffered the fate she suffered, had it been the Black radical tradition that was at the forefront of the mass movement of the 1980s. She would never have. Yet another example is the ways in which the Charterist movement or the mass movement of the 1980s dealt with the IFP. In 1976, hostel inmates, attacked residents in Mzimhlophe. We needed to think carefully through this. There was no way we could have authorized an attack, a counter-attack on Mzimhlophe hostel. We had to find an explanation and twist, if it was, in fact, twisting things, we had to make sure that there was not going to be any counterattacks against hostel inmates. And well, it is true that we saw policemen in vans, taking supplies into the hostel, and it was clear that it was the police who actually orchestrated that attack, on the residents. The long and the short of it is that we were able to contain, that it didn't actually explode. But come 1984, it is as if the IFP went berserk. But there was no vocabulary, there was no ways in which Black people could come together in 1984 and talk about how to deal with the IFP problem. Instead, because the think tank came from outside, Black society, the only way to deal with, with the IFP was to antagonize it. And, the outcome is what we saw, the popular violence of 1984 to 1993. But as a last word here, we often talk about that violence as stretching from 1984 to 1993. Again, that in itself, is a bit misleading, because the violence actually begins in Sharpeville and Sebokeng in 1984. It began on the 3rd of September, 1984. But in actual fact, the violence itself, an event that falls within that pattern happens in 1983. And it happens at the University of Zululand, when the Zulu Amabuto attacked and, left a massacre at Ngoye campus, where anything between 7 and 9 students were killed. And, quite a score of students were actually maimed. That's where the violence began. And if, there was a Black radical tradition in charge of the mass mobilization of the period, maybe, just maybe, something could have been done to mitigate, the devastating impact the IFP had on the political landscape. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So where are we taking it from for next week's lesson?
Let's start with 1985, and contextualize Makis Kosana. Ntiki, I'm the one who speaks about Makis Kosana a lot, because for me, if ever she represents one thing, she represents the final assault on black radical thinking, as part of
Okay.
the liberation struggle formations. That's
And
what
then,
she says.
and can you also prepare your lecture on Ntate Credo Mutwa?
Yes,
We'd
yes,
love to
yes,
understand him a bit more.
yes. Should that be a separate lecture, or should it be part of it? Because we can still put it in there, between 84,
Yes,
between 82 and 85.
please,
We could still expand on it there, yes.
please. We really appreciate that.
Okay, okay. But was
Ntate,
this
please, we,
useful? I often ask, is it useful? Is
I
it,
was just about to say we are truly indebted to you giving us your time and your wisdom. We really appreciate this because this is the stuff that we didn't learn in school. So you're giving us a context of our own history and giving us the picture of where we come from so that we know where we're going. So we really appreciate. That's why I was worried. Good. Are you gonna be able to keep up every single Wednesday?
yeah, I'm good.
We are so blessed. Thank you so much. And thanks to
Okay,
everybody who
thanks.
joined in. Up next on Moya Podcast, we're in conversation with Prof. Sipho Siepe now at 8 p.m. So please can we just move to YouTube and go watch. Thank you so much, everybody.